Okay, so just a little bit about me. I am residing in Nebraska, and I did work for the state of Nebraska Air Quality for 17 years. I've been in environmental consulting for 6 years. I do a lot of training. I'm a certified auditor. Those are the things I'm doing most of the time is auditing and helping people comply with all regulations. And that's me. So I'm going to talk about the top 10 air permitting and compliance tips. This first one may seem, like a no-brainer, is to read your draft permit and provide comments. You need to make sure there are realistic operational limits and that your records align with the day-to-day operations. Make sure you're looking at that, even if you hire a consultant, because they may not know how you're keeping records on site. You get a permit and it says you're going to keep track of, daily amounts in tons received or shipped of grain, and you're like, well, we keep track of bushels in this way. You need to make that known at the beginning when you're reading your draft permit. Understand the testing requirements, understand what's going to be happening once this final permit is signed and the timing of it. And make sure you're commenting or communicating your concerns to the consultants. Make sure the consultants are communicating to the agency that's drafting your permit. Once you get the permit, again, seems like a no-brainer, read and understand the permit. A lot of times people get a permit, which can be a painful process, and they're like, oh, here's this 50-page document, and they set it in a file, and, I'm sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and actually read and understand the permit. You may have operational limits like Bob talked about. You may have testing requirements, monitoring, record keeping. You also, because this takes so much time to actually get a construction permit, you may actually have built something that doesn't align with what you thought you were going to build, and your permit says one thing, but really you built something else. That's a problem. So you need to know that and get that, either corrected right away, but just really read and understand. The other thing to know is if you are subject to federal regulations, whether it's new source performance standards, subpart DD, or if you have engines, you may be subject to, 4I or 4J. Your permit may only just say that. This is your requirement, and may not, and most likely won't go into detail about what that means. You're expected to know what all of the requirements in that federal regulation are and how it applies to you. So you may need to ask for help and clarification. I think some permitting agencies are trying to get a little bit better about being a little bit more descriptive with their permit requirements, but that's not always the case, especially since our federal regulations change so often. That's typically why they don't put specifics in a permit, so you don't want to be stuck with something that goes away. So it can cause concern on either end of the spectrum. So you want to assign responsibility. If you're the only EHS person, you're the only one keeping records, that might be easy. But a lot of times you're gonna, the superintendent is going to ask maybe an operator to take visible emission observations, or is going to ask the office staff to keep track of monthly throughputs. So you need to assign and communicate those responsibilities. And a lot of times when I'm going to do audits and I explain to someone why they're keeping a record, they'll say, I don't know, I'm just supposed to keep this number. And I'm like, well, do you know why? And I explain to them, and they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. And then they do a better job of keeping the record. They get it. They understand that it's a permit condition, and they understand why. So why is it important, and how should it be documented? Mainly, and where should the records be kept? How often should the whatever you're doing be conducted? Make sure someone knows it's their job and understands what that is. So maintain and operate air pollution control equipment. Typically, they're very expensive to install, so you want to make sure they're operating correctly. Usually, if you have a permit, and it will say maintain and operate appropriately or in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications or industry standard. Make sure you understand what's in there. A lot of states will put in your, pressure drop has to be between, 1 and 5 inches. Well, you just may not operate that way. And then you're gonna have to go to the state and explain that. That kind of goes back to tip 1, is reading that draft permit to make sure that it aligns with your equipment in operation. You may need to operate within those specific parameters. You may need to take pressure drop readings daily. You may need to do PMs in a certain amount of time. The biggest thing that I see when I do audits related to air pollution control equipment is not that I come and it's usually always operating the way it's supposed to be, the way the permit says. It's either someone's not keeping records of the operational parameters, or they're not keeping records of that maintenance. So that maintenance piece, you're doing it. Most likely, everyone, has a really good PM program. But if you're not documenting or you don't know how to easily retrieve that document, an air pollution or an air inspector might say, how do I know it's being maintained properly if you can't show me? Again, if it's not documented, it's not done. So keep good records. Make sure you're conducting your required inspections, maintenance, and observations in accordance with your permit or your federal regulations. So again, that could be your visible emissions observations. A lot of your permits will say you can go out and just determine whether or not there's visible emissions, on a weekly basis or whatnot. But if you see visible emissions, you may then have to do a Method 9 reading, so you may have to be certified. Just make sure you understand what that is for your specific situation and that you're documenting it correctly. Also, a lot of times, records I see of these observations, it may not say the time that the observation was conducted. Well, where that's important is an auditor might come in and say, well, did you do that at midnight? How could you even see anything? How do we know what time you did that observation and what day and what the conditions were at that time? So again, just keep records, especially if you're a highly visible facility that may get a lot of complaints because of bees wings, those types of things. You want to over-document what you're doing. And that goes along with the haul roads maintenance as well. Check yourself. Don't wait for an inspector to come and tell you you're doing it wrong. That's a little late, and I know everyone gets busy, but in the long run, it will save you time if you're conducting your own internal monitoring, whether it's conducting your own internal inspection or you're hiring outside parties to help you with that, people like me can come out and do a full multimedia, look at your spill plan, look at your air records, have someone take a look and check you, and make sure you're rereading that permit at least annually to make sure you're complying with it. And then document what you did to make corrections and why that happened in the first place. Why is it every year we don't have this record? Fix that and be preventative and proactive. Make sure you communicate your operational changes. That's something that I think has come up with all of our discussions. So internally, this can be a challenge sometimes. Operational folks might be off one way, and the environmental health and safety people aren't involved in those discussions. Make sure you're talking to each other. If you have a corporate office, make sure you're letting them know. Also discuss what those operational changes mean regulatorily and those implications. Again, a consultant may have some additional knowledge that, hey, wait a minute, this may mean this in the future. Let's step back and think through the process. I we've all been regulators, and we have all answered lots of questions on the phone. Don't be afraid to call your regulatory staff. Most of the time, they'd rather help you than try to clean it up in the end. Even the enforcement folks, they'd much rather work on the assistance side of the house rather than the enforcement side. It's much easier for everyone. So when you have questions, definitely get help, whether it be internally, a consultant, or the regulatory agency. Make sure you're submitting the required reports and keeping those records of your reports. You're going to have annual reports, semi-annual, emission inventory reports, potential malfunction reports. There's all sorts of notifications and reports you may be required to submit even if you don't have a permit. So in some states, you may be exempt from permitting, but there's something regulatorily that says if you emit 5 tons of particulate matter a year, you have to submit an emission inventory. And people miss that a lot. So just make sure you're submitting and keeping track of those submittals. The biggest thing is maintaining and organizing records. This is something I harp on all the time, and it's something we help people with all the time. Most of the time you have to keep 5 years of records. A lot of the audits I've been doing at grain elevators, it's like 1 year and done. They're like, well, we thought we just needed 1 year. No. In air quality, and for the majority of your regulations, this is 3 to 5 years. Air is usually 5. Make sure you have a central location. Regulators can show up at any time, and Murphy's Law has it will be at an inopportune time, whether it's because you're golfing or having a stack test or something else, or the general manager or the EHS person is not there. Typically, they're going to conduct the inspection no matter what. So you should have more than one person who knows where those records are kept at all times. And make sure, of course, that they're aligned with the permit requirements. Oh, and easily retrievable. A lot of times, some inspectors and auditors will be patient and say, sure, I'll give you an hour. Some will say, if you can't, give it to me right now, or you're looking at me like deer in the headlights, pretty sure we're going to start digging a little bit harder. So any inspection I've done, when I go and they have organized records, it's a much quicker inspection, typically for everyone involved, and the inspector will dig a little bit less. And lastly, ask for help. Ask your peers within the grain industry. If you have a corporate office, or people like Brian who have been doing this for a long time, ask for help. Obviously, the Grain Association is one of the best places. They have great resources in working with regulations all the time, consultants, and again, the regulatory staff and assistance providers. So definitely ask for help, and that's it.
Thank you,